Good morning, everybody. Will you go ahead and turn it on? Just one second, please. Okay? Does that sound okay? Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming out this morning to learn more about the condition of the state of Washington's budget and how that's going to impact you as students, especially here at Shoreline Community College. What I like to do is to share with you a little bit about what we know at the state level, and then bring that home to here at Shoreline Community College. And then you're going to hear from some other folks about the actual impacts to the college, as well as starting to think of ideas of what you may do to help try to mitigate or minimize the impacts to higher education in general and Shoreline Community College specifically. So with that said, first I want to thank Gunn and the student government leaders, your student government, for organizing today's event. I think this is very important that all of you come and really get more active about what's happening in the state of Washington, especially how it impacts you as students. So thank you, Gunn, and the student leaders. Also, you're going to hear from Amy Kinzel, the president of the faculty union, and she's going to give you, from her perspective, how they see these impacts to our faculty and ultimately to all of you. So thank you, Amy, for being here to talk with the students as well. So last week, the governor held a press conference to talk about the state's economy and the proposal of what she's looking at in terms of reducing the state's budget, and she has identified up to about $4 billion worth of reductions that can be made in order to cope with, at the minimum, what is looking like a $1.4 billion shortfall, and in some ways people are really using a planning number of $2 billion. So what she has essentially said is the conditions in the state of Washington are dire. So now this is on top of, can you imagine dire in the context of what's already happened? So she talked about how over the last 3 years, $10.5 billion have been cut from the state's budget. And she used the term dire last time when we had to make adjustments based on the economy's impact. And then to come back and say, again, the situation is dire. It's actually ultra dire now. Because now what you're talking about is potentially another $2 billion reduction to the state general fund, which will come from a smaller and smaller number. Because at the outset, you had a much bigger number in which to balance the impacts from. Now, as a result of that $10.5 billion cut over the last 3 years, that number that we're talking about now in which to make reductions from, I believe she identified was about $8.7 billion to adjust for about $2 billion. Now, the House of Representatives here in the state of Washington really believe that number is closer to about $6.9 billion. So what's the effect of that, right? You're talking 8.7, you're talking about a 23% adjustment versus if the number is closer to 6.9 billion of about 29% adjustment. So this is a huge piece of differences that have to be resolved to figure out what can we really adjust the budget, what's the base number in which to do those adjustments from. So stay tuned as the legislature goes into session in November to reconcile those differences and finally get to a number that we can now start to seriously do some planning around. So with that said, let me just share a little bit about what the governor said in terms of why are we in this mess. And I want to be clear, it's not because of anything that we have done at Shoreline Community College. It's not anything that the state of Washington has done that has resulted in us being in the current mess that we find ourselves in. Part of it is people are not buying. In the state of Washington, 50% of the general fund budget is made up of sales tax. So if people aren't buying, well, that's going to have a direct impact on our general fund budget. Also, employers are not hiring. As you can imagine, if employers are not hiring, therefore there's less people with paychecks, and therefore less people with paychecks means less people are also spending, right, or buying. In other words, so you have the effect of people who currently have the potential to buy who are not buying, and then you have another group because of the unfortunate impacts who are unemployed or without work who are not in a position to be consumers. So you bring those two together, and that's partly why we're in this mess. Well, it doesn't end there. As you all know, Washington, D.C. has, to be kind to them at a minimum, been at a stalemate. So we cannot get a vision out of Washington, D.C. to get America back on track to essentially get people employed. So we've got the issues in Washington. And then we have issues on the global stage that are also impacting us here in America as well as in the state of Washington. So as many of you have been following, I hope you've been following what's been happening in Europe and their own debt crisis. And because of the way economies are now more and more interdependent, what happens on a global scale has local impacts. So you take all that together, and that is why we're in the current situation that we're in. So let me talk about it in the context of what are the actual numbers that we're hearing from Olympia in terms of higher education cuts, and then we'll talk about it in terms of what's happening here at Shoreline Community College. So the governor last week unveiled a series of cuts that could be made in a broad sense. She hasn't laid out a budget, so I just want to caution you there, okay? She hasn't laid out a budget yet. What she's done is identified large areas in which reductions can be made, and based on that, she identified up to $4 billion worth of cuts. Obviously, she's not planning to implement up to $4 billion, but she has identified $4 billion. Let me talk about those areas that would have direct impacts on you as students. So one of the big areas is the student need grant. Student need grant, as identified in her budget, was up to $303 million. And then she laid out some scenarios based on the different categories related to the student need grant. And I'm not going to get into those details, but just to say to you, please pay attention to decisions being made that will impact student need grants, and I'm sure many of you currently receive student need grants. Also, she said that she was going to reduce funding support to our colleges and universities, and she ran a different level of scenarios that started with 20%. So at 20%, we're looking at $222 million reduction to the institutions of higher education. That's not just community colleges, but that's all of the publicly funded higher education sector. In other words, the University of Washington, Western Washington University, and the other regionals, as well as the community colleges. And then she ran some scenarios from 20% down to 15%, which would be $166 million, and all the way down to 10%. What we're hearing out of Olympia, out of the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges, is that we would be looking at about a 15%. So that number of $166 million is probably where they're looking at making adjustments to the general fund as it relates to institutions of higher education. Now let me just stop here and just add a point of clarification that I didn't mention earlier. The way the state budget is set up, you have some discretionary parts of the budget and you have non-discretionary parts of the budget. So non-discretionary parts of the budget is the part that the state essentially cannot touch for a variety of reasons. And so it's out of the discretionary part of the budget that the $2 billion would be reduced from. Unfortunately, the discretionary part usually includes things that are not protected by the Constitution or some other types of commitments. Higher education is in the discretionary part of the budget. That's why you're seeing this huge impact to us at the level of what I just mentioned in terms of the general fund portion. Also be aware that they're also looking at the state work study program for further reduction. And that's in the neighborhood of about $8 million. So just be sensitive. Those of you who are on state work study know that that program could be cut to the tune of $8 million, and it would have, I'm sure, some negative impacts on many of you in this room. So with that as the kind of broad umbrella, what does this mean for Shoreline Community College, specifically from a budget standpoint? I'm not going to talk about impacts. I just want to talk about from a budget standpoint. So over the last 6 years, just to put it in context, we have cut $8.7 million from Shoreline Community College's general fund budget. 8.7. So the number we're now talking about, within the context of probably what will happen in the next 18 months, could be anywhere from $4 to $6 million. So can you even put your head around that? Right? If you've already cut 8.7, and you may cut on the low end maybe $4 million, that's almost half. So you're going to do almost half of what you've done over 6 years in less than 18 months. That's going to have a huge impact in not so positive ways on this institution. But to characterize it differently, 8.7 plus a $4 million, that's the size of some of the smaller community colleges in the state of Washington. Remember, Shoreline is, in terms of size, we're about number 10 out of the 34. So if we cut 8.7, an additional 4, maybe 6, that's the size of a small community college that has been eliminated from the decisions that we've had to make over the years, and due in large part to the state's economy. So let me talk about some strategies that one ought to be thinking about as you go forward, and then you can start talking about this more fully. I think as students, you got to get active. You got to get active in the legislative process. Okay, you've got to get active. But how you frame your message becomes important. And I think you're going to hear more about how to go about doing that. But let me just leave with saying this piece, okay? How you frame that message, remember it's in the context of what is also being pitted against higher education, and that is social services. So how does the state of Washington make decisions when they know that the impact is either going to come out of social services or higher education? So as you think about how to approach this, how might you respond in the context when the choices really come down to those two areas primarily? And I think a strategy that can bring those two together as a way to articulate the impacts to students, I think would be an effective message. Because I can tell you, I've met students here at this college who are homeless. I've met students here who are single parents. And so when you start talking like that, you're also talking about what? The social services side of the equation. So how do you start thinking about bringing those together? But I think if we can come together and you can develop an effective legislative strategy, you can go a long ways to mitigate the cuts to higher education, and specifically Shoreline Community College. And I say mitigate because the state's got to deal with the fiscal reality. But I think the other side of this too is the college is working on some revenue strategies. So it's not like we're just doing all cuts and not thinking about revenue and the future of the institution. But I'll leave that for another conversation because I'm at the end of my time. So with that said, thank you all for coming together to think very seriously and thoughtfully about your future and how your future is directly interwoven with the conditions of the state of Washington and with the conditions of the United States, and how you might start to play a greater role in trying to turn that around to say that higher education is the solution to what ails this nation and this state. It is the solution. Don't starve your solution. With it.
I would like to thank the college president again, Lee Lambert, and I would like to welcome the president of faculty